Thank you once again for having me. I've not been quite right the last few days. I don't have as much volume as I normally have. I'll make an effort to speak up, hopefully, and the rain on the roof isn't too loud. Which has also meant I've not been quite up to date with my prep, and I'm usually pretty chaotic in the best of times with my prep, so apologies if it doesn't make sense, but I was very reassured by Colin's prayer just then, because I'm going to preach on Proverbs 5, so if you want to turn that up, please do. And I really was thinking, is this a good thing to preach on tonight? I wasn't sure, but just something about Colin's prayer chimed with some of the things excuse me, that we're going to look at tonight. So I trust that it is from the Lord and that he will help us. And we believe that the whole Bible is inspired, I trust. I'm sure we do. And that means that every chapter God wrote. Whether it's fun and exciting narrative or to us relatively dull lists of names, or things that in our English sensibilities we would rather not talk about openly. It's all God's word, isn't it? He wrote it all, so it's all profitable. So with that in mind, let's read Proverbs chapter 5, and we'll read the whole chapter. Proverbs chapter 5 verse 1. My son, attend unto my wisdom, and bow thine ear to mine understanding, that thou mayest regard discretion, and that thy lips may keep knowledge. For the lips of a strange woman drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold on hell. Lest thou shouldst ponder the path of life, her ways are movable, that thou canst not know them. Hear me now therefore, O ye children, and depart not from the words of my mouth. Remove thy way far from her, and come not nigh the door of her house. Lest thou give thine honour unto others, and thy years unto the cruel. Lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labours be in the house of a stranger. And thou mourn at the last, when thy flesh and thy body are consumed, and say, How have I hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof? And have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined mine ear to them that instructed me. I was almost in all evil in the midst of the congregation and assembly. Drink waters out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. Let thy fountain be dispersed abroad, and rivers of water in the streets. Let them be thine own, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as the loving hind, and pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. And why wilt thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman, and embrace the bosom of a stranger? For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he pondereth all his goings. His own iniquities shall take the wicked himself, and he shall be holden with the cords of his sins. He shall die without instruction, and in the greatness of his folly shall he go astray. So what we're going to try and do is look at the one picture that is given here, and take three separate lessons from it. And we'll try and work through them in order, but the three lessons from this I've entitled Human Affection, Wisdom, and Christ's Affection. So those are the three things, and we'll build up from that, because the picture has to be a valid picture in order for us to draw lessons from. Later on in Proverbs, when it says, Go to the ant, thou sluggard, the ant has to work as a picture of not being lazy before you can extract a meaning of not being lazy from it. So we're going to work our way up these things. And the first thing is to establish what Proverbs chapter 5 says about the relationship between men and women, the right relationship. So a few introductory things in order to help us. If you look at Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8, Proverbs chapter 1 verse 8. My son, hear the instruction of thy father and forsake not the law of thy mother. So the whole book of Proverbs is, like, if you like, it's framed as advice from a father in particular, but also with the advice of a mother to a son. And so it often says, my son, listen to this and hear the words of thy father. And later on, these are the words of does it say thy mother or the queen? Or so there's advice being imparted to a son in particular, and that matters. And part of the advice, and it comes out particularly in this part of chapter 5, but in other places, is about how men's affection should be directed towards women. And it's very clear in this passage. And so that tells us a few things. The fact that this is set down as advice given from an older generation to a younger generation, from a father and a mother to a son, shows that we can't just assume people know this. You can't just assume a generation growing up. So we don't need to tell them this stuff. They know it. We can't assume this. God has taken the time to write it down, and write it down in this format. The format of passing on this knowledge to a generation that comes up after us. And we see here that it is positively taught. We're given good examples to follow, and we're given bad examples to go away from. But it's not hinted at. It's not euphemistically described, even though it's carefully described. It's quite clear, and to that extent, I think it's worth saying. I have to say to myself, and there's a, as we sort of say, there's a ditch on either side of the road on this sort of thing. But we need to not be more prudish than the scriptures are, and we need to not be more vulgar than the scriptures are. So that there's dangers either side, but I think sometimes, especially because we find these things quite, I myself find these things quite awkward to talk about sometimes, about the relationships between men and women, and the thought of teaching your children. This is the kind of thing you're going to need to watch out for. This is the kind of thing you're going to need to positively aim for, and not just be sort of vague and euphemistic, and so that they don't actually know what you're saying. We need to take the scriptures kind of language and not be afraid to say this is clear, this is definite, and this is right. So, and I think some people have tried to be careful on this and have erred too far, and they would say things like, well, you can't warn people about all the bad things, because doing so, you're planting ideas in their heads. You can't tell people that there are, if you're married, there might be other women who you can find. You can't tell them that, because that will make them wonder, what about... The Bible doesn't take that line, does it? It sets out very clearly the possible dangers to warn you against them. And so it's not... So we need to be confident to say all that the scriptures say, and not say, I won't tell my children that, or I won't remind my church of that in case I plant a seed of sin in their hearts. No, the Bible knows that we have all the necessary seeds of sin within ourselves already. The Bible is here to help us, if we're Christians, to combat sin and to fight it. And so we need to be careful to limit our advice to scriptures, but also not just so we don't go too far out of what the scriptures say, but also to say the fullness of what the scriptures say on these matters. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so there's a few introductory things, and then about our passage in particular. Because of the structure of Proverbs, the advice given to a son, the whole of this chapter is framed as a man towards a woman, because the advice is given to a son. Now, I don't think that means that this passage has nothing to say about women towards men. I think it's a narrative structure, and that the narrative structure brings out truths that are more generally understood. Because otherwise we'd say, well, the passages about laziness are only said towards men. or the passages about gluttony are only said towards men. You can find the whole of the book of Proverbs to men. If you're going to say, well, actually, it's all written from to a son, and that son is male. So I don't think it has nothing to say to it. In fact, I think it has a lot to say to each side of the man-woman relationship. But I think there will be some aspects that are particularly pertinent to how a man acts towards a woman and how a husband should act towards his wife. So there are lots of truths that go both ways, but I think it doesn't. The fact that its narrative structure is instructions given to a son does matter as well. I think that ought not to be overlooked, but it also not to constrain us in our application. So that's the first thing. It's not exclusively about men towards women. Secondly, I would say it speaks both to people who are married and people who are not married. My first assumption for that is that I understand this to be written to a son who is not yet married. So this is your advice as you grow up. This is the kind of wife you will need to look for. This is the kind of woman you will need to avoid. When you are married, this is how you are to live. So even though I think we're all married here, it has something to say to us. But just because it's dealing with marriage doesn't mean it has nothing to say to unmarried people, because I think the whole thing was written to someone who wasn't married at the time of reading it, because it gives aspiration and framework. So it teaches both the married and the unmarried. So that's useful to highlight. Thirdly, then, in terms of our framework for this passage, a verse that is always coming back to me is 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12. It's a very famous verse, and it says, "Wherefore, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." And it's a very important verse. The warnings that are given in Proverbs chapter 5, in particular on this issue, are given because it's possible to fall. I don't think this is just hypothetical. Here's some bad things that could happen, but it's not really going to happen to you. So the warnings are given because there is a very real possibility of people falling into this kind of trap, this kind of sin. And it seems to me from 1 Corinthians 10 that it's the people that think that they're never going to fall into this trap that are in great danger of falling into the trap. Let him that thinketh he stand take heed lest he also fall. And let none of us say then, oh, we're above this. I'm safe. I can't fall. I don't need to heed these warnings. It needs to be said that these are a real possibility. But it also needs to say that the warnings are there because the possibility of sin can also definitely be avoided. So just because you can sin doesn't mean that you will sin. Just because you could fall doesn't mean that you will fall. That's the reason it's here. Because God doesn't want us to fall into sin. He doesn't want us to waste our life. He doesn't want us to fall into all the destructive, unhelpful sins and patterns that are in the chapter. He's put it here for us to learn from. So it's not defeatist to say, take heed lest you also fall. And say, I could fall into this. Yes, you could. But that knowledge that you could is part of God helping you not doing it. And so it's worth considering both sides of this. If we are tempted to go astray, there are very strong warnings for us to not go that way. And if we're happy with where we are, there are very strong encouragements for us to stay happy where we are. And so we have to listen. We have to listen to this passage wherever we are. If we are content, and that's a great thing to be content with a marriage or content to be single. There are things to be said to us to encourage particularly the enjoyment of our marriage. But if we're tempted to go astray, there is something to be said to us here to help us stay where we should be. So, the human affection, then, it should also be noticed, and Proverbs talks in what we might call generality. What we might call, and a word I can't say, generality, whatever that is, general terms. It uses general language, so it might not always fit absolutely every single case you might find, but it talks in general terms about things that are generally true. And it is assumed that the son will want a woman. That is just assumed. Now, I understand that there are some who just live a celibate life and have seemingly no interest in affection for the opposite sex, and that's the Bible seems to understand that and say that those sorts of things happen. And I understand that there are people who feel no inclination sexually towards the opposite sex, but towards the same sex, and the Bible recognises that too, and says that it's wrong and gives help and advice. And so I'm not saying that none of those things exist, but there is just the general assumption that this is generally what will happen. A son will desire a woman, and that's something that God put in humanity. When Adam saw Eve, I think he was probably pleased. Because God put that in him, and it's like, that's what I needed. That's who I needed to fulfill me and complete me, and that desire and the affection and all that sort of stuff was natural and God-given. There's no fall at that point, so it has to all be right. But I don't think that died away with the fall. The natural inclination of a man is towards a woman, and the natural inclination of the woman is towards the man. And so that's how it's framed. And so understanding that, the question is, well, what kind of woman are you going to go after? Since you're going to be going after a woman, that's the sort of general understanding. You'll have these desires, you'll have these affections. Where are you going to go? How are you going to direct them? How are you going to take them? And I will be talking, because it's the language of the passage, about a man after a woman, but I do want you to fill that in the other way around in your heads as well, and say that this does apply to from a woman towards a man as well. The natural instinct of a woman will be towards a man, and the question is, what kind of a man? And how are you going to direct that affection? So it does go both ways, but I will be mostly using the language of the passage, because otherwise I'll be tripping up all the time. And the Bible offers two women, if you like it. Really, it's one woman and a group of women, but we'll call them two women. There's the strange woman, and there's the wife of your youth. They're the two options in this passage. And really, the strange woman is every woman that isn't your wife. That's it. Every woman in the whole world that you're not married to. And if you're unmarried, that means every woman in the world. So every woman is a strange woman if you're not married. And if you are married, every woman is a strange woman apart from one. Okay, you get one woman that is part of you and joined to you and known to you. That's the idea. You know each other. Everyone else is strange, different, unknown, not linked, separate. And so the strange woman then, because she comes in. She comes into our narrative first in verse 3. For the lips of a strange woman drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. It needs to be noticed here that sin, this particular type of sin, as personified in this strange woman, is active in trying to entice. It's not passive. It looks inviting. It's appealing. The lips of a strange woman drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. Kids are great at this sort of. They're really such vivid pictures. Like the sweetness of honey. Like Josiah has recently just started enjoying honey, and he just can't get enough of it. it just loves more and more. And when we go to the shops, I was like, "Oh, Layla, do you want me to get anything from the shops?" So Josiah piped up from the back, "Can you get me a jar of honey?" Like, it just wants more. And if he sees a jar of honey, I found him hugging jars of honey. He just wants more. It's enticing. He just wants to keep eating the sweetness. And the Bible said that's what sin looks like. It's enticing. It's saying, "Ooh, look at me! Don't you want some of this? Isn't this great? Come on!" Do you see that it's not just sort of passive, sitting over the side, sort of unnoticed, unless you take an interest in it. Sin is active. If you look at chapter 6 and verse 24, we'll see a bit more of that. Proverbs chapter 6 verse 24. I will go from 23. For the commandment is a lamp, and the law is light, and reproofs of instruction are the way of life, to keep thee from the evil woman, from the flattery of the tongue of a strange woman. And 25. Lust not after her beauty in thine heart, neither let her take thee with her eyelids. Verse 24, flattery. Sin tells you what you want to hear. It's not true, but it's what you want to hear. It's enticing. It's active. Lust not after her beauty. In verse 25, neither let her take thee with her eyelids. Good, God-given characteristics like beauty and kindness and generosity can be used by sin to draw us after something that is not rightfully ours. And this is why we need to be on our guard, because we need to be on our guard against it. This isn't something that will only be a problem if we walk towards it. This is a problem that will come after us. And how it comes after us is so varied in our society. It comes at us in ways that are so various. It's hard to list them all. Also in ways that are so odd to the Proverbs 5 understanding. I'll try and explain that a bit later. But if we're going to be on our guard, we need to be on our guard in all areas, and that means with the close relationships we have with people, especially in churches and work and places like that, but also in the casual encounters that we have with people, and the encounters or the things we see on the internet. Do you see, if we're aware that sin is actively trying to entice us into something, then we need to be on our guard against it and be prepared whenever we go anywhere where sin might get us, that we're armoured, we're protected by the things that God has told us. And one of the things that we need to remember about all the enticement of sin, doesn't that look great? Doesn't that look great? The Josiah-like love of the honey, and when we feel that pull on us, it's not honey. That's what you need to remember. This is like seeing something that looks like honey, and you think, "Oh, I'll have a bit of that," and you stick your spoon in and you put it in your mouth, and it's earwax, and it turns. I mean, that's a horrible image, isn't it? And like Chris is squirming, and even just a tiny bit of earwax that's on your finger that you haven't noticed it's horrible, isn't it? But that's the kind of image you need to have in your mouth, in your mind when it comes to this kind of thing. It may look great, and that's what Proverbs 5 says there in verse 3. For the lips of a strange woman drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil, but her end is bitter as wormwood. It might look great. It might seem like just the thing that we want, and you think, yes, that's what I want. And the Bible is saying, it's not what you want. If there is something that you want, if you want your desires to be satisfied, this won't satisfy them. And that, of course, is the great lie of sin, is that it offers us a sating of certain desires and never satisfies them. But there is a way for them to be satisfied. We'll look at them later. But that is sin's great pull on us. that it latches onto something that we want and then never gives us the thing that we want, but then manages to convince us that you'll get it next time. And that's not to say there's never any kind of enjoyment in sin. There is. I think in Hebrews it says that Moses chose not to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, but chose to suffer with the people of God. He could have had some enjoyment out of sinning, but it would have ended in bitterness and wormwood. And I've heard, I might even mention this here before, I heard a comedian talking about the kind of hedonistic lifestyle of a travelling stand-up comedian. I'm sure it's the same with musicians and all, the big and film stars. They can go wherever they like and have whoever they want, men, women, whatever they want, wherever they go. And he talked about just the instant disgust that you have for someone after a one-night stand. It's like you think, oh, I want that. They're beautiful. I want them, and he just instantly, as soon as it was like, I don't see you again. And that, but then he carried on, and then you do it again, and he's making a joke out of it. But actually, there's some real insight. That's what sin is like. It says, you want this, don't you? You say, yeah, I want that, and you have it. It's like, oh, it's not what I wanted. Here, try this one instead. And you try, oh no, that's not what I wanted. Here, try this one instead. Oh, that's sort of okay, but once it's over, no, it's not what I wanted. That's what sin will do all the time. And see, when God is saying, don't go down this way, it's because he loves us. It's because this won't satisfy us. Going after someone that isn't our spouse will actually just end up in bitterness, and the passage goes on to say it can end up ruining your whole of your life. It'll take your money away, it'll take your labour away, it'll take your satisfaction away, it'll take everything away. And God is saying, whatever you think you're going to get out of that, you're not going to get it, and it's going to destroy you. And we do well to listen to God on these things. And we really would. And it's I've just summarised verse 9 to 11. I'll read verse 9 to 11. Lest thou give thine honour unto others, and thy years unto the cruel, lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labours be in the house of a stranger, and thou mourn at the last when thy flesh and thy body are consumed. Sin always takes much more than it gives. And it offers the happiness and satisfaction of human desires, and it takes so much more. And we need to, again, I've talked relatively generally, been slightly specific, but because I think the lesson is about sin in general, but it is about particularly sexual sin, and it really has to be emphasised that is what is highlighted here, and because there are certain consequences to it that are different to other kinds of sins, and that's really what verses 9 to 11 are highlighting, is that if you sleep around, there's a good chance you'll have children by that kind of activity. And you won't necessarily know who the father of whose child is, and you'll end up supporting them just in case it's yours. And that's the point of the... But now I know that we've got DNA tests and all that sort of stuff these days, but the principle still holds. If you sleep around and you have a child, well, it can be even more easily proved that it's yours. And then you've got your own children to upkeep from your natural wife, and you've got these other children to upkeep from this other woman, and it can destroy you financially. All your work is taken up, given over to someone else, someone who you can't see and love and spend time with. And so sexual sin always takes more than it gives. So for that moment of enjoyment and pleasure, it can take away a lifetime of satisfaction and happiness. And that's quite a stark thing, isn't it? That one sin that can last for a very short space of time can change the whole course of somebody's human life. And I'm not comfortable saying that because you all know what I'm talking about. You all know that I'm saying that you can have sex with someone at one particular time, and we don't want to think about that, but this passage is forcing us to think about that and say that one sin, go after that one woman, that one time, or vice versa, go after that one man, that one time, and it can change and ruin the whole of your life. Doesn't that bring the seriousness of not going after the strange woman? Really big in our minds, because the New Testament tells us that every other sin a man commits, he commits sort of with his own body, but when you sin sexually, there's another person involved, and because it often does produce children, then the consequences are huge, and that ought to be really sobering and a real break on our temptation to go elsewhere. And this is where applying some of these things to modern day life gets slightly tricky, because the internet and pornography have disassociated people from sexual gratification, if that makes sense. Because in order to go after a strange woman at any point before, like, the printing press, and certainly before the internet, you'd have to go and find an actual woman. But not anymore. It's a different, almost a different ball game with this, and it doesn't mean it's right. I'm not trying to say that means it's okay. It just means that there's a whole new way of getting it wrong, and lots of young men in particular, but not just young men, are being drawn into this because they think there are no consequences. Because we know that the passage says the consequences of sleeping around means that someone might get pregnant. Well, there's no consequences to just watching pornography in that sense, are there? No one's going to get pregnant for what happens with one person in a room. But it needs to be said that all the effects of sin are the same for that kind of sin as they are for the others, in that it will waste you, it will take more than it gives, it destroys your view of human beings. It turns women and men into just sexual objects. It removes responsibility from actions, because if you fathered a child, you had to step up to being responsible for that child. But here you can just see women as just, and it is particularly men, so particular, you just end up seeing women as objects for gratification without any consequences. And we need to be on our guard for that as well. It's not, pornography isn't like a lesser kind of sexual sin because there isn't another person physically in the room with you at the time. Not just because other people, real people, have been involved in the making of it. That is a real issue as well. But because all the effects of sin will destroy us just as much as if we were sleeping around. Okay, so that's hopefully enough of that. There's some serious warnings there about what the strange woman will bring if we are taken with her. But more positively then, the second woman is, I've entitled, the wife of thy youth, which I get from verse 18. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. God says there's this whole way of getting this wrong. Going after this strange woman, going out of your way to something that isn't yours. But there is a way of getting it right. And I love that. I love that God knows us, and he's not saying everything that you know and feel must be denied and suppressed and just kept out of the way. He's saying, actually, I made you to enjoy these desires, but I made you to enjoy them in this way and in this place. And actually, if you do that, it's the best thing for you. And so the wife of the youth is where all of those good desires that God gave you find fulfillment and satisfaction. And so when it says in verse 15, drink waters out of thine own cistern and running waters out of thine own well, some people say, oh God, it's so restrictive. I hope there is a bit of a euphemism there. I hope we all understand it. It means Sleep with your spouse. keep it in the marriage. It's just you two. And people say, God, it's just so restrictive. I mean, God's just such a killjoy. But he's not. He's looking out for us. He's giving us the best things to satisfy us. And that kind of attitude is the same kind of attitude that if you said to them, drink water out of the tap. And they're like, well, why can't I drink the water out of the puddle on the floor? It's like, well, because this is good for you. And we have to just, when God says stuff like drink waters out of your own cistern, it's not because he's trying to ruin our fun. It's because he knows what happens when we drink waters from other cisterns. And he's expanded that in the first half of the passage. He said, this is the stuff that is good for you. This is the clean water. This is helpful and healthy and enjoyable. Follow this. Do this and live. It's not like do this and be miserable all your life. This is something good that God has given us. So we need to, when we read these exhortations to narrowness in our sexual affections and narrowness in our intimacy, that's for our good. God is saying this is a good thing for you. Verse 19, it says, let her be as the loving hind and pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. This is always very difficult to talk about with, in my experience, with women, because I've tried very hard not to make this personal tonight. I'm going to try very hard to keep it that way, but I've summarised some parts of verse 19, that this is an attitude of the mind and an inclination of the heart. Now, in my experience, women often want to hear it's just an inclination of the heart. But I have decided to love you doesn't sound great to women, does it? When we went for some sort of marriage classes before Layla and I married, the couple there said, sometimes he said, my wife will ask me, why do you love me? And he'll say, because I've chosen to love you. And she's like, that's not what I want to hear. I want to hear you tell me about all the things you love about me. And I'm saying that actually both of those come into play. It's not enough to just be carried away with the affection and the beauty of someone. But I think that should be there. Because our passages have said that a strange woman can be beautiful. But that's what Proverbs 6:25 said. Lust not after her beauty. Doesn't deny that she has beauty. But it's that combination of the desire towards someone and the choice to keep your desires on that one person. And to then focus your enjoyment to that person. And so it's this balance of the inclination of the heart. And I think a husband and a wife should be inclined towards one another. I would hope to find some natural inclination there. But it's more than just that. Because if it's just based on how you feel, based on how you look at them today, or how attractive you find them right now, that's not going to get you through illness. Because nobody's attractive when they're ill. And that's not going to get you through times of argument and disappointment and all those sorts of things. It needs to be built on more than that, and that is a conscious choice and decision to love that person. And because you've chosen that, then you choose to find your satisfaction in that person. And this is where it seems to me God is wonderfully gracious. He gives you more and more as you choose to go his way. So as you seek to love someone and choose to focus your affection and attention on them, you find more and more that you can genuinely, instinctively love about them. And it grows and grows and grows. And so this again is God being good towards us. And it should be so that the more and more that we focus our affection on one person, that the harder and harder it is for us to even be tempted. And that's cautious about saying that because we've said that we need to always be careful that we can be tempted. But there should be a closer and closer union, love, desire between us, that actually, whatever we're faced with the fact that if a temptation comes along, nothing about that temptation is my wife. So I'm not interested. And if that's how we feel naturally, that's great, because that's where we should be aiming. And that's the kind of thing we need to cultivate. I think that's what's really hinted at or said in verse 19, where it says, "Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love." No other breasts are the breasts of your wife, so they're the only ones to satisfy you. No other person can completely captivate you. That's what to be ravished is. And so that's what captivates you. So when you look at another woman, you don't see a person that can captivate you because they're not your wife. And we need to, and vice versa with husbands, we need to cultivate our affection so that we enjoy that which God has given us more and more and more. That is a real safeguard against going away, against sin. Not just because we know that if we sin, there could be awful consequences, but because actually to love our wives is the best thing that can be for us and for them. It's the happiest we will be, it's the most satisfied we will be, and it's the good and right outlet for all of those desires that God has given us. I'm going to leave that bit there because that's taken a lot longer than I thought. But that's the picture. That's the baseline picture, and it's a very important picture. So it's not just a picture that's established only for us to learn a higher principle from. It really is an important lesson that we are to only find the outlet for all of our sexual, intimate desires with one man and one woman together in marriage. Everything else is a problem, and within marriage is true happiness and joy found in the expression of those things. And so with that as the groundwork, there are two other things we can say that picture establishes, and these, don't worry, these won't take half as long. A common theme in Proverbs is wisdom, and one of the ways the book uses wisdom is to say that wisdom is personified as a woman. And so a couple of references, chapter 1 verse, surely that's not right, it's verse 20. Chapter 1 verse 20, "Wisdom crieth without, she uttereth her voice in the streets." It's like, we know wisdom is the true understanding of God and the world, but it's like she's a person. It's a picture, but it's a very powerful picture. It's there in chapter 2 and verse 2. "So that thou incline thine ear unto wisdom, and apply thine heart to understanding. Yea, if thou criest after knowledge, and liftest up thy voice for understanding, if thou seekest her as silver, and searchest for her as for hid treasures." Wisdom is, and you see what it's setting up wisdom as a parallel with the wife of thy youth. And say that kind of affection, that kind of desire that a husband ought to have towards the wife of his youth is the kind of desire and affection we need to have towards wisdom. And it uses that as a picture. And so we take all of the things that chapter 5 has said about the strange woman, and we say that is all so-called wisdom and all so-called knowledge that is contrary or opposed to God. It might seem alluring, it might seem enticing, but all of it ends in death. It can never satisfy, it can never make us happy. It will always lead us away from a place where we can be happy. But the wisdom that is from God is the kind of thing that if we invest in, if we focus on and choose to enjoy, we will find it gives and gives and gives, and it's the true place of happiness, and that really is all I wanted. That's the picture. You have to go away and do your homework on that if you like, but that's quite a powerful picture. You think there's a real sense of warning in getting it wrong with it going after a strange woman, and there's a real sense of enjoyment in getting it right with a strange woman, and God's saying that's the same with wisdom. If you go after the world's wisdom, there's a real danger of going after the world's wisdom. You are getting it wrong, and it will destroy you. It will take away your wealth and your happiness and your enjoyment. But if you go after God's wisdom, as found in the Bible, then we will find joy and happiness in life. And the more we invest in that, the more God will bless us for investing in it. So, human affection, wisdom, and thirdly, Christ's affection. More and more, and I hope it's a good thing, more and more, especially as I read the Old Testament, I want to know what it says of Christ. And I've thought of it lots with the Psalms, how lots of the Psalms can be put into the mouth of Christ, if you like. We know the famous one, Psalm 22, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Christ himself took it, and it came out of his own mouth. And so we know that lots, if not all of the Psalms speak to us about Christ. It feels to me, I'll talk about this later if you're not sure, if you disagree, but it really feels to me that the book of Proverbs can easily be understood as God the Father speaking to Christ the Son. My son, hear these words. My son. Now, I'm not saying that Christ was in any danger of sinning. I don't think he was. But I think it's important that it is written this way. He was tempted. He learned obedience through the things that he suffered. And the devil comes to him and tempts him, and Christ answers with Scripture every time. And I think that the young Christ reading Proverbs hears the words of his Father speaking to a truly obediently son. And gloriously, Christ does fulfill and keep all of the things in Proverbs. He keeps a true weight. He keeps a true balance. He answers a fool according to his folly, and he answers not a fool according to his folly. He takes all of the advice, all of the wisdom spoken by God the Father in this book, and shows us how it ought to be lived. Shows us how it can be done. But more than just the general wisdom, I would say, and it's been a real blessing to me, that as we read verses 18 to 20, I'll read them out again. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as the loving hind and pleasant roe. Let her breasts satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. And why wilt thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman, and embrace the bosom of a stranger? But that's how Christ feels about his church. He loves her. And he loves her in a powerful, all-consuming kind of way. He's ravished with her beauty. And don't get me wrong, I'm under no illusions about where the church gets her beauty from. She gets that from Christ. He makes us beautiful. He cleanses his bride from all spots and blemishes. So I'm not saying, aren't we great, Christ loves us. We're great because he made us beautiful. And he made us great. But that doesn't take away from how much he loves us. And so I find that such a wonderful thought, to know that Christ feels this kind of burning, passionate love for us as his church, as his bride, because that's what we are. And I've said that Christ fulfilled all that the Father asked him. He never sinned. He never got anything wrong. So he didn't get this wrong either. He'll never go after anyone else. He'll always be taken with his church. He'll never embrace the bosom of a stranger. He'll never think that someone else might be more worthy of his time than us, or his affection than us. And that's just been a real blessing to me. That's the kind of love that my Saviour has towards me. Hopefully that encourages us and gives us a model to aim for in our life. I'll stop there.